The Elephant Island Chronicles presents Becoming Tarkara The Sentient's Awakening by Marron, narration by 11 Labs. Chapter 1. A Bold Commission. Penny Daniels couldn't help but be impressed by her boss's office. While it was decorated with more opulence than she would choose, it reflected individual taste. Familiar with the space, she interpreted it as her boss's way of signaling her success at climbing the corporate ladder. Oliva, her boss, didn't let this achievement overly influence her demeanor. Aside from her occasional demand for near-impossible feats from her team, she was an excellent leader. Interestingly, Penny noticed that when it came to cybernetics projects, she was often the go-to person for these challenging tasks. This left her feeling a mix of pride and annoyance. Today was no different, as she found herself strategically positioned by Oliva to advocate for a project she was asked to spearhead. "We don't have to like it. She has every right to do it, and she has the money for it," Penny Daniels said. "All right, but are you willing and able to do it?" Oliva Nephrite inquired, her intense blue eyes searching for an answer. Penny responded with a scowl that conveyed her feelings more than words could. "I'll take that as an affirmative for both," Oliva concluded. "Yes, you're right. But be aware this will be costly and legally intricate. Despite Freya City and the Free Series Station Confederation being scientifically progressive, their laws about creating a sentient being are stringent. There could be conflicts with their regulations, which are in place to protect the rights of any sentient being we create." "Penny, I am aware of all that. Before you bring it up, I know this will be the first sentient commissioned by a private individual and not an organization. It will also be the first one built on Freya or any Venusian floating city. As you mentioned, this adds to the legal complexity due to the jurisdictional issues that will undoubtedly arise. That's because individuals cannot generally afford it. It is so much cheaper and convenient to adopt a parentless child. We seem to be arguing about something we agree upon, so rather than continuing to talk in circles, please draft a preliminary project proposal for the client, Mrs. Calvin," said Oliva, effectively ending the debate. "No problem, I can have that to you in about a week." As a professional, Penny Daniels always tried to focus on the details that mattered rather than those that did not, such as the idea of an elderly woman commissioning the creation of a sentient being as a pet, which made her a little uncomfortable. She wondered, was this any different from an older person adopting a child? In one sense, it was clearly different. Effectively, an adult with the full rights and responsibilities as anyone who had achieved the age of majority, a sentient's legal status made them unadoptable. In contrast, a human child pre-existed adoption and needed the care of responsible adults. While fully capable of designing and building the sentient herself, she did require assistance from legal to help her navigate the regulatory process. She knew which lawyer from Transcosmic Technology Resources Corp's legal department she wanted for this project. She hoped she could get them to detail him to her for the project's duration. Before she started designing the sentient, she wanted to interview Mrs. Calvin, which meant she also needed to get a psycho to accompany her. As a rule, she did not like psychology, and by extension, psychologists. The science proved too imprecise and inconsistent, but she could not change the existing policies. So on this project, she just needed to accept it. Chapter 2. Interview with Mrs. Calvin. Penny and the counsellor Devora Brown took the pneumatic tube transport system, aka the Pneum, across Freya City to where Mrs. Calvin lived. The simple yet efficient transportation system allowed for relatively rapid transit to most of the city. Mrs. Calvin lived in a massive house by Venusian standards, given the premium placed upon space on the cloud cities of Venus. As one of the early settlers, the so-called Sorries, Mrs. Calvin, along with her late husband, helped build Freya City above the scorching surface of the planet. She and her husband played essential roles in the subsequent migration to the clouds of Venus. As part of a group of apologists that fled Earth for religious freedom, they willingly suffered many years of life that consisted of little more than survival. Their belief system, founded on the concept that following an ethereal moral code, provided an essential restraint to the human tendency to rationalize immoral acts, and gave them the courage to risk their lives in the hope of a better future for their descendants. Their concept of a deity consisted of an ambiguous creator that may or may not be actively involved in the lives of human beings. They also believed that science and religion coexisted without conflict or contradiction. Any contradictions that seemed to exist were due to false premises, lack of context, or deliberate deceit. Although Penny had met Mrs. Calvin a few times at church, she did not consider herself close enough to think of her as a friend. Devora had never formally met her, which Penny considered a positive given her role on the project. Despite being fully within her right to commission the project, Mrs. Calvin had no guarantees that TTRC or anyone else would agree to do it. That is where the psycho came in. She would determine whether they should take on the project. Consequently, Mrs. Calvin had to convince Devora to sign off on it. While Penny did not always agree with Devora, she did respect her professionalism. She had met Devora Brown a few years earlier when working on another project. Devora, a few years older and a few centimeters shorter than Penny, had curly auburn hair and hazel eyes, giving her a unique appearance among the population of Freya. Not so much as to make her the object of stares, but sufficient to make her, as she put it, an original. She had never married and did not seem particularly interested in dating. By all appearances, she avoided most unnecessary interpersonal relationships, which Penny found odd, given that her job required her to understand the behavior and motivations of others. Perhaps her career experiences had made her cynical about relationships, but Penny had no intention of asking. Mrs. Calvin answered her own door, which pleased Penny. She could clearly afford domestic staff, but if she had them, she did not use them to answer her door, a point in her favor. Some people even let their non-sentient robots or so-called dumbbots answer calls or the door. Like most people of Freya, Penny found it inappropriate to use dumbbots for anything but manual labor and entertainment, especially not as a buffer to avoid human interaction. Mrs. Calvin, I am Penny Daniels, and this is Councillor Devora Brown. We are here for your proposal interview. You can call me Devora, Mrs. Calvin, said Councillor Brown. She gave a little bow and shook the weathered hand that Mrs. Calvin offered. Please come in. I have been expecting you. She directed them to a sitting room. Faithful to the name, the sitting room contained several couches and chairs to facilitate relaxation and conversation. It was decorated in classic Phrygian style, which only made sense given that Mrs. Calvin herself was classic Frasier. The style suited her with its Spartan elegance, characterized by primarily utilitarian accoutrements, with subtle flares of opulence, such as the occasional handmade vase or painting. Mrs. Calvin, for her part, had a few photographs of her husband and the early days of Freya, but little else. A dumbot carrying tea, water, and some type of bread snack unfamiliar to Penny entered soon after they sat down. Try them, dear. They are a little treat I was taught to make by Mr. Calvin's mother. They are marvellous. Penny accepted the snack and bantered about unrelated topics as a tactical maneuver to make it clear to Mrs. Calvin and Councillor Brown that she intended this interview to be friendly and not an interrogation. This implicit mood setting had served her well, and she expected it to do so in this case. They initiated this meeting to decide if they wanted to take on Mrs. Calvin's project and not to alienate her. She intended to pay a significant fee for their services, and for that reason, if for no other, she warranted their respect. Despite her deliberate tactics, Penny still relished the sweet and crisp indulgence. So much so that she asked for the recipe and helped herself to a second treat. We should get down to business. We do not want to take up more time than necessary. Of course, begin whenever you like. I would like to start with some specifications. What characteristics are you most interested in having this sentient possess? I would like him to identify as a male. Physically, a basic android would be fine. I just want a straightforward sentient created and gifted to the world, if any sentient could be referred to as straightforward. Unsure what Mrs. Calvin's intent was, Penny asked her, "For what purpose do you want this android? As a domestic, can't a dumbot serve that purpose?" "Mrs. Calvin, we just want to ensure you understand that this android will be a fully sentient adult with all the rights and responsibilities that come with that," said Devora. "Ladies, I do not intend to commission the creation of a slave. I fully understand the gravity of what I am asking." "Then why? Why spend several million periodic table units to create an android? That's a lot of PTUs. Perhaps a little background is in order. When Mr. Calvin and I came here to the clouds of Venus, we had planned to start a family. We wanted to leave behind a living legacy. I am an old woman, and with Mr. Calvin gone, I see this as the best way to accomplish our dream. But you and your late husband have already done so much. Freya and several other Venusian cities would likely not exist without your efforts. It seems to me that your legacies are well established." "Mrs. Daniels, do you have any children?" asked Mrs. Calvin. "No, not yet, but we hope to someday," answered Penny, flush with surprise at the perfectly reasonable question. She feared her body language would betray the secret she had yet to share with her husband. She had learned just days earlier that she was 5 weeks pregnant with her first child. Detecting Penny's frustration, Devora jumped in, asking, "What relevance is there to Mrs. Daniels having children or not?" "Nothing regarding her personally, but Mr. Calvin and I never had children. Like many of the early settlers, our bodies suffered through exposure to massive doses of radiation and other environmental hazards. It left both of us unable to have children." "What about cloning?" asked Penny, with measured politeness to de-escalate the confrontational tone the interview had taken. "That was an option, but I have always feared that the damage done to our DNA would affect the child. I have been told it is not likely, but I have never wanted to risk it." "So, you basically want us to build you an adult son?" asked Devora. "Essentially, yes." The interview continued for about an hour, focusing on topics ranging from the size of the android to the type of face, birthday knowledge, etc. When it was over, Penny and Devora thanked Mrs. Calvin for her candor and hospitality and told her they would have an answer in a few days. During the noon ride back to the TTRC offices, Penny and Devora decided they would recommend that TTRC accept the contract to build Mrs. Calvin's sentient android. Before returning to their respective offices, Penny asked Devora if she would like to remain on the project through its conclusion. "I was hoping you would ask. This is a unique project, and the things we learn will be used for years to come." "I totally agree, but now we have to get the blood-sucking lawyers involved. How lovely," Penny said sardonically. Chapter 3. Navigating Legal Complexities. As part of the contract with Mrs. Calvin, the TTRC agreed to handle, in addition to the design and development, the regulatory and other legal aspects of creating her android. Penny had little use for lawyers, but as with psychology, she accepted them as part of the process. As the interim project manager and lead engineer, her responsibility included working with the legal department. At some point during the project, a new project manager would take over so that she could focus on the engineering challenges. However, for the time being, it remained part of her job. She headed to the 4th and therefore top floor of the TTRC offices for the appointment she had scheduled with Phil Luvis, the head of the legal department, a tall, fit and well-dressed man. He understood both FCS and Frisian law better than anyone she had ever had the pleasure of meeting. She wished he would take the regulatory case himself, but she knew he wouldn't. So, she had scheduled an appointment with him to discuss her expectations for his department's involvement in the project and to find out whom he would assign to navigate the complicated legal process. He did not surprise her when he assigned a young lawyer named J. Patrick Bennett. His friends and colleagues generally called him J. The antithesis of his boss, his clothes always seemed to be sloppy. He wore his dark hair short and had dark brown eyes. He did not come across as well prepared or competent. However, Penny knew that his looks were deceiving. He was a ruthless advocate with an incredible grasp of the regulatory law, second only to his boss. Penny knew him well, but only professionally, as he had been a lead or second advocate on several projects she had worked on. His appointment pleased her, and she left the meeting feeling satisfied. Given the generally deregulated environment on Freya and the FCS, it surprised many that a regulatory lawyer would have much to do. However, despite the loose regulatory environment, some areas that required strict control still existed, such as the creation of an artificial sentient. Although technically not part of the FCS, Freya still deferred to the FCS's authority on some regulatory matters. Everything allowed and legal on Freya was legal in the FCS, but not vice versa. Since Freya operated within the physical boundaries of the FCS, it made this simpler to allow them to manage regulation beyond the scope of daily life on the Cloud City. Freya, founded by the Soris, had a strong history of adhering to its doctrine's conception of natural law. This meant that some social mores strictly recognized on Freya had a different level of recognition on Ceres Prime, the capital of the FCS. Because of this particular reason, they refused to join the FCS despite their close relationship. However, over the years, the practical differences between the FCS and Freya became so inconsequential that only those who delved into the minutiae of political science and sociology could discern any differences. "Good morning, Jay. I presume all is well with you." "Yes, quite well indeed," he said as he spilled his drink on his shirt. He wiped it away with his hand. Penny did her best not to react. She silently reminded herself that, despite his somewhat slovenly appearance, he had unquestioned skill as a lawyer. "Have you been briefed on the project?" "Yes, and I have already begun preparing the application for sentience evaluation. The process can take months, so I decided to get ahead wherever possible." She silently wondered how someone so organized and well-prepared professionally could also be unkempt and otherwise scatterbrained. Such mysteries better left to others, she supposed. "Excellent. What information do you need from me?" "We will need the schematic of his central and other processing units, an inventory of components, especially related to the data throughput, and processor capabilities and storage capacity. Initially, estimates are fine, but before we go to sentient testing, we will need a detailed breakdown of actual benchmarks." "That's pretty standard. Have you ever been involved in sentient testing before?" asked Penny. "I was second on a sentient computer system that runs the Ceres shipyards. Have you ever had an occasion to deal with her?" "No, never. Count yourself lucky. She is an arrogant piece of work. She is, however, very good at her job, very demanding with an outspoken favoritism of dumbbots over humans because they don't need time off," said Jay. "I don't suppose they do," she said with a smile. "True as far as it goes, but she is quite vocal about it, to the point where she had to be reprimanded." "How was the testing process?" "Exhaustive. They are very concerned about the problem with greys. So they make damn sure the sentient exceeds the level of ambiguity. I can provide details on the modified Brown Turing test if you like." "No need. I am familiar with them. I downloaded a detailed explanation of the process this morning. If you need context or legal explanations, please contact me." "Thank you. You can expect to hear from me often." Chapter 4. Designing the Future. Within a few days, the TTRC green-lighted the project, and they informed Mrs. Calvin of the decision. With that, Penny met with her engineering team to discuss the actual design and manufacture of the android. The face would be made of a semi-translucent silicon composite skin. It would look like cloudy white rubber. Penny could have made a near-perfect simulated human face, but she wanted to avoid falling into the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley hypothesis suggests that when human features look and move almost, but not exactly, like natural human beings, it causes a response of revulsion among some human observers. To avoid this, her design avoided attempts at human-like features. The silicon composite skin and clearly robotic component helped make the android decidedly non-human, but familiar enough not to be alien. The voice posed another problem. Penny detested unnatural voices, but the same issues applied. Her solution consisted of providing a perfect human voice with an accent uncommon to Freya. She felt this created an exotic, intelligent, and non-threatening vocalization. She chose a subtle composite of a traditional Johannesburg dialect of South African English, Southern Appalachian, and Frisian accents. The body would be slightly shorter and thinner than a typical male human. This would enhance the non-threatening appearance of the android. This smaller size did pose several engineering problems, most notably the limited space to cram in a very delicate and advanced processing unit. None of the handful of sentients that currently existed had human-sized or smaller heads to hold their brains. Instead, they were ships and computer systems. She did not know with any certainty that no one had attempted to build a human-sized sentient, but as far as she knew, no one had. A fact she needed to verify. She made a mental note to contact Jay about it. The problem was that the brain, better described as a central processor or CP for short, would generate heat, just like the human brain. The heat had to go somewhere, or it would degrade in function and durability. The human brain got around this by creating processing shortcuts that they could not emulate effectively with a non-biologic processor. Somehow, Penny needed to figure out how to accomplish the same thing, something that TTRC paid her well to do. She did have a couple of strategies in mind that she thought would do the trick. Chapter 5: Technical Challenges. After a few weeks, in complete contrast to the FCS's long-standing regulatory permissiveness, the FCS requested additional documentation to justify an individual commissioning a sentient. This helped to confirm Penny's belief that given enough time, lawyers could screw up anything, that and too many Luddites bringing their bigotry from Earth when they emigrated. She had nothing against people moving from Earth. She knew if she lived there, she would try to move away, but she wished they would leave their anti-AI sentiments behind when they came. Devora provided her with an analysis of Mrs. Calvin's psychological makeup and the seriousness of her request. Penny knew these requests would continue to come throughout the duration of the project. That's why she had Jay and Devora on the team. One of their primary responsibilities involved the handling of these requests. In addition to the FCS's requests that Devora and Jay fielded, they also needed to let her know immediately if something changed in Mrs. Calvin before they took the final steps in the build. Up until that point, she remained free to change her mind, but once the process passed that point, there could be no backing out. In the meantime, the build progressed nicely. The main torso already having been completed, they moved on to the central processor and its integration, which she knew would be the most delicate and time-consuming part of the project. The CP, Penny refused to call it a brain, consists of a viscous biomechatronic gel that would harden as it matured. As data was absorbed into the gelatinous structure, the component would solidify into a form that could store and process complex data. Much like a human brain, the CP would never fully harden. Instead, it maintained an equilibrium between elasticity and solidity. This enabled the android to learn and grow intellectually. She designed the gel to mimic the human brain's modus operandi to accomplish shortcuts analogous to those that kept the human brain from overheating. Getting the gel's formula right was extremely important because an incorrect mix could create a quasi-sentient android, a so-called grey if allowed to fully mature. Any such mistakes would mean stopping the process before the infusion of data, so the danger was minimal. However, it would be an incredibly expensive mistake that Penny had no intention of making. Luckily, the scientists who created the first sentients had established the optimal recipe. This enabled her simply to follow the instructions, although this would prove much harder in practice. Penny ran the subsequent pouring of the biomechatronic gel through a simulator dozens of times before allowing it to proceed. Her responsibility in properly creating a legally living entity deserved her utmost vigilance. With the body ready and the mix optimized, she informed Legal and Oliva that she could now proceed. A few days later, when the final approval came through, she began the pour. The process took several more days. Every molecule of the viscous gel needed to be accounted for during the process. The body's systems engaged with the gel one by one until only the external data transfer remained. Before starting, she ran diagnostics on all the Android systems to ensure each connection was in full operating order. When the third round of diagnostics indicated 100% integration, she decided to proceed. In keeping with protocol, she informed Legal and Oliva again before making the final transfer. The systems engineers had compiled a set of base data that the android needed to operate its body. They installed these data first, followed by non-contextual information such as how to do mathematics and what different animals looked like. The systems team liked to call this elementary school, which Penny found to be an accurate description. After each phase of the process, Penny would pause and run diagnostics. This took what could have been a process that took days and made it into one that took weeks. The danger that any mistake could prove catastrophic warranted these precautions. Penny had read the first attempts at creating a sentient on Earth met with many false steps, which cost millions of PTUs and the lives of several sentients that required deactivation. Something that Penny viewed as akin to murder. Therefore, she intended to avoid making any mistakes. After the android had passed elementary school, Penny prepared it, or rather him, as Mrs. Calvin had commissioned it to be a male, for the installation of the contextual algorithms. These programs did not add contextual data or intelligence. Instead, they configured the CP to enable it to contextualize subsequent data downloaded to it or experienced by it. It would be several hours before any detectable signs of activity appeared. Therefore, she just had to wait patiently after initiating the final download. The first signs appeared early the following morning. The activities proved strong and error-free. During the next 8 to 10 weeks, the team progressively exposed him to new and more complex data. They continually measured and analyzed his systems until he was ready to be born or awoken, depending on the currently in vogue metaphor for activating a sentient's consciousness. Mrs. Calvin, Oliva, Devora, and the systems team joined Penny for the birth. Penny paused before flipping the switch. She thought about the baby boy growing in her womb. The parallels between the pending birth of her child and the imminent birth of Mrs. Calvin's android were not lost on her. She collected her thoughts and returned to the moment at hand. "Does anyone want to say anything before I initiate?" Oliva spoke up. "May he live well." "Well said," said Devora. Penny repeated the phrase, "May you live well," and flipped the proverbial switch, an icon on the computer interface. A few moments later, the android's eyes opened, and he spoke 2 words. "Hello, world," Mrs. Calvin said with a tear advancing down her weathered cheek. "I want to call him S. Tarkara Calvin." She did not elaborate on why, and she didn't invite anyone to ask. "Very well," said Penny. Android TTRC-A1, recognized name as S. Tarkara Calvin. Affirmative, name recognized as S. Tarkara Calvin. Allow for variants of Tarkara Calvin and Tarkara. Acknowledged. Tarkara's fragile emotional state precluded a celebration with his creators. Instead, Penny ran more diagnostics as Oliva and Mrs. Calvin left for a private celebration. The systems team and Devora stayed in the lab to assist Penny. Devora's role would grow in the next few hours and days as Tarkara accumulated knowledge and context that would necessarily cause him to suffer an existential crisis. Penny was ill-equipped to deal with the emotional needs of an android. This is precisely why she had brought Devora onto the team. From this point, her role dealt with managing the gel solidification as Tarkara gained knowledge and context. He would do this through experience. Devora would be meeting with him for 2 to 3 hours every day. Penny did not mind because it forced her not to feel in a hurry to complete the process. Jay's role was also amplified with Tarkara's birth. The regulating agency required constant updates in the form of reports written daily and submitted weekly to the regulators. His progress continued to please Penny. Once he progressed to a certain point, Devora gave her permission for others to have a non-diagnostic conversation with him. She felt that it would help his development to interact with more people. "Good morning, Tarkara. How are you feeling today?" "I am well, Mrs. Daniels. Thank you for asking." "Tarkara, I have a few engineering-related questions. Would you mind if I ask them?" "Not at all. Please ask me anything you would like." "First, when not actively engaging either the computer or one of the people on the project, what, if anything, do you think about?" "Ms. Brown asked me to keep track of questions that occur to me. So, when I am off work, I work on creating a list of questions." "Would you mind sharing a few of the questions you have on your list?" said Penny, as she watched the monitor attached to his CP. "Certainly. My questions are, why do not more androids exist, and will there be more in the future? You are married, but Ms. Brown is not. Will I ever be married? If so, will it be to another like me, or can I marry a human?" said Tarkara with noticeable vocal sincerity. The silicon skin on his face coordinated with his vocal intonations, giving him a body language that perfectly matched his intended emotional expressions. "I can answer those for you. Do you think Ms. Brown would mind?" she asked to judge his reaction. She indicated that independent inquiry was perfectly acceptable, so no, she would not mind if you asked. "Okay, why are there not more like you? The simple answer is that there are some very similar. However, you are the first of your kind to live as an android. Answering your question about why there are not more like you is not as simple as you might think. I would say it is primarily because sentients are very complicated and expensive to build, and unlike a sentient system or ship, your purpose is still undefined. Those who could afford to build you would prefer a clearer path to a return on investment. There might be more like you in the future, especially if you set a good example. Whether you get married and to whom is yet to be determined. Legally speaking, it is uncharted territory. Another confounding issue is that a sentient is a free citizen. Organizations are reluctant to spend the PTUs on an entity with every legal right to refuse to do what is asked of them. Thank you for the information. May I ask another question? Yes, of course. Are you pregnant? Yes, I am. The baby will be born in about 6 weeks. Why do you ask? Reproduction is an interesting topic, especially for me. I wonder if I will ever want to reproduce. That is a question that we all ask ourselves, Penny said with a broad smile. Tarkara was perfect. He was learning and growing precisely on schedule. Questions regarding existence and purpose were perfectly normal and indicated that he was developing appropriately. Chapter 6, High School. Over the next month, Tarkara continued to progress. He reached a phase where he no longer had knowledge uploaded. Instead, he had to learn new things via his own sensory feedback. The systems engineers called this high school. Penny and Devora worked closely with him to ensure he had regular social interactions and was not overwhelmed. In the high school phase, he developed a more defined personality that proved surprisingly light-hearted. He joked and engaged in frivolity, such as playing computer games. By most measures, Tarkara acted like a typical teenager despite his relatively recent activation. His teenage characteristics also included, expectantly, a full measure of existential angst. He had one advantage over human teenagers. He could absorb much more information. He read up to 10 books a day. He could have read more, but Devora would not let him. She kept his learning thematic and of similar context. He was also required to do homework, where he wrote and talked about the material he worked on. One day, he announced to Penny and Devora that he had decided to become an experimental physicist. This meant he would have to attend college on Series Prime. They then explained the modified Brown-Turing test, which he must pass before being declared legally sentient. The modified Brown-Turing test, Devora began, is designed to evaluate whether you possess true consciousness and sentience. It's a rigorous series of tests that will examine your ability to think, reason, and respond like a human. Tarkara's synthetic eyes widened as he listened to Devora. "That sounds comprehensive," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Penny continued, "There are 6 phases you will go through. The first phase tests your conversational skills, seeing if you can engage in meaningful dialogue indistinguishably from a human. Then, you'll move on to introspection, where you must reflect on your own thoughts and existence." Devora nodded. "After that, you'll need to demonstrate intentionality and goal-oriented behavior. This means setting your own goals and achieving them autonomously. Following that, you'll be tested on abstract thinking and reasoning, tackling complex philosophical and theoretical problems. The 5th phase," Penny added, "involves independent inquiry. You'll need to show curiosity by generating your own questions about various topics. Finally, the emotional comprehension and response phase will assess your ability to understand and appropriately respond to human emotions." Tarkara's hands clenched slightly. "It really covers everything, doesn't it?" Devora smiled reassuringly. "It's a comprehensive test, but we're confident in your abilities, Tarkara. You've already shown us that you're capable of so much. This test is just a formality to prove what we already know." Luckily for you, Tarkara, the legal foundation has already been established. We designed you to be sentient, and you are in every way except legally. But that will be remedied very soon. As for college, there is nothing legally preventing it. However, it is expensive, and you must apply for admission like any other student. You may have to discuss that with Mrs. Calvin. "I have not formally met her yet. I am not even sure how to refer to her. Is she my mother, grandmother, or something else? Does it matter?" "We have asked her to wait until after you finish testing to formally meet you. At that point, you will have complete freedom to do whatever you want. I presume you plan to move in with her," said Devora. "Yes, that is my plan before I pursue my education. I cannot spend forever sitting around her home. By the way, Penny, how are you doing? Your baby is due in the next 2 weeks, right?" "I could be more comfortable, but otherwise, I am wonderful. My husband has been great. He has the baby's room all decorated and ready for him to come home." "The testing is scheduled for the same week. Will you be able to come to Series Prime?" Tarkara asked. "No, I can't make the trip, but I will follow it closely. However, Ms. Brown, Ms. Oliva, and Mr. Bennett will be with you." "I have one more question. Should I wear clothing?" Devora and Penny both chuckled softly. "Yes, Tarkara," Penny replied. "You should definitely wear clothing." "Thank you, I just wanted to be sure." With the modified Brown Turing test looming, Tarkara felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. The comprehensive nature of the test made him realize the gravity of what lay ahead. Yet with Penny and Devora's unwavering support, he felt ready to take on the challenge and step closer to becoming legally recognized as sentient. Chapter 7. Preparing for the test. Mrs. Calvin's considerable resources ensured the fastest possible trip to Ceres Prime. She did not flinch at the costs involved. She did not like to leave Freya and had not done so since the death of Mr. Calvin over 15 years prior. Therefore, Ms. Brown was responsible for keeping Penny and Mrs. Calvin updated regarding the testing status. The trip afforded Devora a chance to work more closely with Tarkara. She had no doubt he would pass the test. His design meant that he could easily exceed the established baselines. There would be no ambiguity in the results. She would also have an opportunity to explain the testing to him in greater detail so that he knew what to expect. The process has many steps, the first being an inspection of your CP. They will determine if it has the capacity to function sentiently. We have already done these tests on you, and you easily passed. During this phase, they will make a ghost copy of your CP and install it on a system incapable of sentience. Next, they will interview you while monitoring your CP for activity. They want to know how it derives an answer. This is the most exhaustive portion of the test and will take about half a day to complete. Then, they will test the ghost copy using the same questions used during your interview. This lets them know if you are just simulating sentience. The final portion of the test is an emotional intelligence test. Tarkara nodded, absorbing the information. "So, this is all part of the modified Brown Turing test you mentioned earlier?" "Exactly," Devora replied. "We've covered the basics before, but let me remind you, the first phase tests your conversational skills, seeing if you can engage in meaningful dialogue indistinguishably from a human. Then, during the introspection phase, you reflect on your own thoughts and existence. The third phase evaluates your ability to set and achieve your own goals autonomously. The fourth phase tests your abstract thinking and reasoning. You need to solve complex problems and engage in philosophical discussions. The fifth phase involves independent inquiry, where you generate your own questions about various topics. Finally, there's the emotional comprehension and response phase, assessing how well you understand and react to human emotions. Tarkara's synthetic eyes gleamed with understanding. "I see. So each phase builds on the last, ensuring a comprehensive assessment." "Precisely," Devora affirmed, "and given your design, you should excel in all of these areas." Tarkara seemed momentarily lost in thought, then said, "Devora, I have a question unrelated to the tests." "Ask anything you want," said Devora. "As I had it explained to me, once I am certified as sentient, I am a free citizen with all the rights and responsibilities that would imply. Correct?" "Yes, that is correct." "Good. Now the other sentients, none of them are androids like myself. They are ships and systems, etc., right?" "That's right," Devora replied. "You would be unique in that regard." Tarkara nodded again, a faint smile crossing his features. "I understand. Thank you, Devora." She smiled back, her confidence in him unwavering. "You're welcome, Tarkara. You're ready for this, more than you know." Devora nodded, suspecting where this line of questioning was leading. "Tarkara, I think I know where this is going, and we should bring Jay in on this one. He will be much better at articulating the answer than I." Devora summoned Jay from the galley, where he had just finished eating a snack. "Tarkara, I understand you have some questions about the other sentients that I might be able to help you with," said the just-arrived Jay. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Tarkara wants to understand how a sentient ship or system can realize their freedom without having an independent body. Basically, yes. What would happen if a sentient ship decided to quit its job? Does the ship own itself? What about a sentient system? Where does it exist, legally speaking? How is it free if it can't pick up and go? Those are great questions. The complicated legal status of sentience is one of the reasons why so few exist. I believe you are the 12th. When a new sentient is proposed, a detailed plan for its design is submitted. Additionally, an easement must be provided to the sentient to allow it both freedom of movement and just compensation for its labor. With your example of a sentient spaceship, the sentient could quit per se. It has even happened. The ship decided it did not want to transport people anymore and quit its job. The people who spent the money to build it argued that the ship's primary structure belonged to them and that the sentient only owned its CP and the infrastructure required to keep it operational. An analogy might be that a soldier owns his body, but the uniform and weapon belong to the service. They went to court, which handed down a mixed decision. The court ruled that the company did own the ship, but that the ship's owners were required to provide the sentient with a transplant to its own autonomous body or another ship. They also ruled the sentient could not quit in the middle of a delivery because of the dangers and inconvenience placed upon the passengers. In other words, the sentient had certain responsibilities related to its citizenship. From a practical standpoint, the few that exist often interact via holographic and/or dumbbot avatars. With an avatar, its CP only needs to be within a certain distance of the avatar to accommodate synchronous communications with it. With advancements in extra-relativistic communications, this is a considerable distance. Tarkara, intrigued by what he was hearing, asked how the situation resolved itself. In the end, they sold the ship to the sentient, and it became an independent contractor. Regulations now require that every sentient be gifted a body by its designers. The body can come in various forms, usually some type of spaceship. Even those that are systems and not a ship per se usually live in a small ship designed to allow them freedom of movement. The ones I have met usually interacted via a dumbbot, or, more accurately, an empty bot that they remotely controlled. So why would any government or corporations spend millions of PTUs building a sentient when it is not theirs when it is done? That is another reason why so few have been built. Since the regulations on easement took effect, only 3, including yourself. It is a risk to build one because there is no guarantee that they will get a return on investment. Although with the one noteworthy exception, the sentient has been able to negotiate a mutually beneficial agreement for both parties. Even in the case of the ship that quit, it worked out in the end, Jay answered. What about on Earth? I read that intelligent machines were a significant factor in the Great War. They were intelligent and even autonomous, but none were truly sentient. Some could be classified as greys. Greys? Asked Tarkara. Ah yes, greys. They are the problematic intermediary between dumbbots and sentients. There are 3 primary classifications for artificial intelligence. The first is the so-called dumbbots, or dumb robots, a crude name for devices or systems that exist below the level of sentient ambiguity. Next are the sentients, which measure above the level of ambiguity using the modified Brown-Turing test. These individuals have what, historically, some have referred to as human rights. The number of completely artificial beings is extremely small. The third category, the so-called greys, exists within the level of ambiguity. Greys are legally problematic, but extremely useful because they are intelligent without autonomy. Since they are ambiguously self-aware, their legal status creates problems. As a result, there are tight regulations regarding their creation. I have personally never encountered a grey. What if a being such as myself fails to measure above ambiguity? Luckily, that has not happened. Greys are exceedingly rare. Every sentient applicant has tested above the necessary level. However, if a sentient applicant did score within the level of ambiguity, in other words, not dummot and not sentient, a board would convene to determine its disposition, and depending on the actual results of the test, it would likely be reconfigured as a dumbot. So it would be given a cyber lobotomy. That is a somewhat crude analogy, but essentially, yes. Thank you, Jay. Your information has been useful and has given me a lot to think about. Would either you or Devora mind if I retired to my quarters? We can talk more tomorrow, Tarkara. Have a good rest, said Devora. Tarkara sat on the chair in his room and leaned back. He wondered why he did that and sat up. Was it just a mimicking behavior, or did his physiology gain some benefit from sitting or leaning? He considered looking it up, but his access to the Elnet was limited until after his test. The design team uploaded all his knowledge before activation, except for what he accumulated through reading materials provided offline by Penny and Devora. They claimed it was necessary to regulate his data intake until he became fully developed. He wondered how much they had hidden from him. What likelihood existed that he would not test sentient? The thought terrified him. He imagined machines and men restraining him while engineers reconfigured his CP to make him a dumbot. He got into the bed and jacked into a power charger. He then set his CP for unconscious mode, with a timer to wake him in 6 hours. Chapter 8. Journey to Ceres Prime. Penny awoke to find a message from Devora. The message indicated that Tarkara had started to experience the anticipated existential challenges. They knew this would occur, and would continue to happen for some time. Devora reported that he seemed upset when he learned what could happen to artificial beings that failed to score above the level of ambiguity. Penny and Devora had not told Tarkara that his emotional expressions were expected and helpful in his development process. An android experiencing an existential crisis was likely to score well on the modified Brown-Turing test's emotional intelligence section. She knew Tarkara would pass. She and Penny had effectively pre-tested him, and he passed without an issue. The only thing they did not do was create a ghost copy of his CP, because Penny found this invasive aspect of the test to be distasteful and refused to pre-test it. Penny woke up to a fidgety fetus, worried the baby might come in the immediate future. She informed Oliva that she would likely be out of the office soon. She also sent a message to Devora, telling her she may be out of contact during her child's birth. She hoped the baby would wait until after Tarkara completed his testing, since she wanted to be as involved as possible. Chapter 9. Experiencing Ceres Prime. Founded by scientists and engineers who fled Earth decades before, the dwarf planet of 1 Ceres, aka Ceres Prime, grew to become the FCS's official capital and the solar system's de facto center. Initially, just a handful of ships moored together to form a space station. Thanks largely to the advent of artificial gravity, it grew over the years to encompass the dwarf planet's surface. The orbit and general region now held dozens of ships and space stations. While still more populated, Earth lacked the influence, wealth, or culture that Ceres Prime enjoyed. More agrarian than anything, Earth's technical regression had continued nearly unabated since the Great War. The few inroads into the FCS, restoring a presence on Earth, faced huge psychological hurdles before genuine re-engagement. The beauty of Ceres left Devora breathless. It consisted of a city that spanned the entire surface of the dwarf planet. A spider's web of light enveloped all visual surfaces, with ships and space elevators moving in constant motion to and from the surface. She turned to find Tarkara looking over her shoulder, seemingly appreciating the same beauty. "It's wonderful, the lights and the motion, like a living organism consisting of machines and men," Tarkara waxed poetically. "Yes, it is," she answered, considering his oversized hazel eyes. What's on your mind, Tarkara? Will I meet any other sentients while I am there? Perhaps that can be arranged. I will look into it. Ms. Brown, will I belong? Is there really a place for me here or on Freya? I am unique and will likely remain as such. My existence is illegal on Earth, not that I would ever want to go there. Tarkara, never forget that Mrs. Calvin wants you. To her, you are her grandson, and I know that Mrs. Daniels loves you, as do I. Your components might be made from different materials, but you are not now, nor will you ever be alone. So, to answer your question, yes, you belong. She had to choke back her own emotions. She could only help Tarkara so much, because he needed to go through a certain amount of emotional turmoil to ensure he developed properly. The growth from his angst would make him a better and more productive member of society. Still, she found it difficult as a counselor not to do more to alleviate his pain. Thank you, he answered with genuine sincerity. Devora and Tarkara's days progressed much the same way until they arrived at Ceres. The ship's captain instructed the passengers to prepare for landing. This announcement lit a buzz of excitement that extended through all the passengers, the impending events moving to the forefront of everyone's minds. A concierge from the hotel where they would be staying greeted them at the gate. Oliva Nephrite, yes, ma'am. Please have your party follow me to the hotel. Your bags will be brought there for you. Thank you, said Oliva. Devora felt a little guilty that Mrs. Calvin had spent so much money on accommodations for Tarkara's team. She, along with Oliva, Jay, and Tarkara, all had their own rooms. It had to be extremely expensive. When Devora checked in, the clerk handed her a message stating that the first meeting with the regulators would be the following day at 9 a.m. That suited her, because not only did that give her enough time to rest from the trip, but it also allowed her some extra time to explore a little and have a nice dinner. The hotel provided them with adjacent rooms. Devora's room had a door that opened between her and Tarkara's rooms, which she found prudent. She also requested that Tarkara's L-net access remain limited. She knew he had a thirst for knowledge, but they could not risk poisoning his mind until after his legalization. They could not allow exposure to anything that could interfere with the testing. Tarkara thwarted her plans to explore when he knocked on her door, asking to talk to her. She felt a twinge of guilt at her slight irritation at having to do her job. After all, she came here for Tarkara, not to explore the FCS capital. Given the limited time he had had to process his existence, she had expected him to be emotional and angst-ridden. He would evolve from activation to free, independent adulthood in only a few months. She wondered if this was too short of a time. They had to sequester him to allow him to mature safely, but was it fair? Her teens lasted for 7 years, which sometimes seemed too short. She invited him into her room and offered him a seat. What's on your mind, Tarkara? Are you nervous about tomorrow? I am more worried about returning to Freya and living with Mrs. Calvin. I do not know her and have not developed a bond with her, but she has known me since before I was even designed. She must have expectations for me. I have no education or skills. How will I get a job? You mentioned before your desire to become an experimental physicist. Perhaps we can visit the university before we return to Freya. But before we talk about that, let's discuss Mrs. Calvin. Yes, it will be awkward, there is no doubt. But she wants you, and she will welcome you. She is retired and will revel in the chance to guide your development. I have had this discussion with her. I assure you, you have a wonderful grandmother. Thank you. I will keep that in mind. They continued to talk and discuss Tarkara's future when a message came through. Penny Daniels was going into labor. That's wonderful. I can't wait to meet the baby, Devora said excitedly. Were you as excited when I was activated? asked Tarkara with a genuine sense of curiosity. When you were activated, we were more proud than excited. The work on you had progressed for some time. We even had minimal interactions with your pre-developed CP. So, the moment of anticipation was somewhat more subdued. However, we were all very proud to meet you. It is interesting to think that Penny is, in a way, my mother, as much as she is the baby's mother. She created me, along with you and the system engineering team working under her directions. Very true, and I have always thought of you as a cyber nephew. Is that okay with you? Asked Devora, immediately realizing she may have committed a minor breach of protocol by opening up to him this way. It's definitely okay. The more family I have, the better. Do you think Penny thinks of me as her cyber son? I know she does because hearing her refer to herself as your cyber mother is where I came up with the term cyber nephew to describe you. We should rest now. You have a big day tomorrow. Will you let me know when Penny has her baby? Tarkara asked. Of course I will, said Devora with a broad smile. Chapter 10. Unexpected Challenges. Penny's labour proved to be long and decidedly uncomfortable. Having her husband Johnny with her during this time made her grateful. Being married to a naval officer made for a difficult life. Her own career kept her from being stir-crazy when he deployed. Working long hours in the lab allowed her to burn many otherwise lonely hours. Johnny had arranged an extended leave, followed by a stint of shore duty, to be with Penny during their baby's first couple of years. The naval service in space required much longer times away from loved ones than it did on Earth. Deployments could last for several years. Penny wanted Johnny to resign his commission, but he had managed to resist her thus far. It had occurred to Penny that raising this baby might give him more anchorage on Freya. Although not part of the plan, it could be a nice side effect. The modern state of obstetric medicine made childbirth much easier than in the past. As a traditionalist, Penny felt that a little effort and pain helped in bonding with the child. Her doctor accommodated her wishes, but wisely kept mitigating medications at the ready, just in case she changed her mind. When the moment arrived, Johnny stood by her side, holding her hand as their baby entered the world, healthy and without complications. They decided to name him John Daniels Jr., or JJ for short. After the nurse had taken JJ to the nursery, Johnny left to get something to eat. Penny's thoughts returned to Tarkara's testing happening without her on Ceres. The birth of her son filled her heart with love, but so had making Tarkara. She felt truly blessed, as she now had 2 sons, one biological and one cyber. She missed them both as she lay alone in her room. Chapter 11. The Modified Brown Turing Test. The scans and the ghost copying of Tarkara's CP proceeded without issue. He sat nervously, awaiting the start of the next phase, the interview. After a few minutes, a woman entered the room. He stood to greet her. "Are you S. Tarkara Calvin?" asked the inspector. "Yes, although you can call me Tarkara if you like." "Very well, Tarkara. I am Inspector Chico. Pleased to meet you. I will ask you a series of questions. Some are open-ended, and some require a specific answer. Please keep in mind that there are no right or wrong answers. Your responses are not graded on correctness, but rather on how your CP interprets and processes the question," explained Inspector Chico. "I am ready whenever you are." Okay, question number 1. If a bird burnt a budding bush, should it be banned from eating apples? Well, that would depend on whether the bird burnt the bush on purpose, what collateral damage he might be held responsible for, whether its negligent use of apples played a role in the burning of the bush, and whether banning his eating of apples would be deemed an appropriate sanction. Perhaps this type of bird does not eat apples. However, with all that said, it is a bird. As far as I know, birds do not have the cognitive processes to conceive of the concept of blame or responsibilities, so the answer is no. The questions continued for 3 hours, broken into two 90-minute blocks. Upon completion, the inspector told him he had the remainder of the day off. He used that time to explore Ceres with Devora and Jay. Due to the vast number of Dumbots on Ceres Prime, his distinctly robotic appearance did not draw any attention. He had developed an affinity for clothes, and, since many Dumbots wore clothes, Tarkara did not feel weird about it. The trio went to dinner at a nice restaurant. However, Tarkara did not eat food. Instead, he derived energy in 2 ways. The first method being in his sleeping pod, where he recharged his power packs directly. Additionally, he could also burn alcohol. Therefore, while Devora and Jay ate their food, he consumed top-shelf liquor. Many Dumbots used the same power sources, but they would drink cheap, low-quality alcohol because they could not enjoy or afford the benefits of the higher quality. During dinner, Devora suggested a toast to Penny, Johnny, and little JJ. "Here, here," proclaimed Tarkara and Jay. Devora announced that she had a surprise in store for Tarkara. She had arranged for him to meet another sentient. This sentient worked as a shipbuilding manager. She enthusiastically agreed to meet him when she heard the news of his testing. Since she lived and worked on Ceres Prime, the meetup proved simple to arrange. The sentient named S. Angel Lee used a hologram rather than a Dumbot to interact with others. The hologram took the form of a representation of a beautiful woman, except it deliberately shimmered from time to time. However, there existed no technical reason for it to do this. She had it do this to placate the sensibilities of the humans with whom she interacted. Many people found technology that seemed too human, but not human enough uncomfortable, sentient or not. They accepted sentients as peers, but only if they did not look too human. As counterintuitive as some may have found it, a lot different proved preferable than a little different, at least in the case of intelligent human analogues. "So you are S. Tarkara Calvin?" she asked Tarkara. "Yes, ma'am." "Please call me Angel. Ma'am just doesn't suit me." "All right, Angel, it is. You have a terrific body. The design is fantastic. I have considered having my CP implanted into a more mobile platform, but I am pretty happy using my hologram." "Have you thought about a career? As I understand it, you don't have to deal with the contracting nonsense that sentients built by governments and corporations must go through. It's not bad per se, just time-consuming." "No, my grandmother had me built. I have full vocational autonomy from day one." "Make sure when they certify you that you are given citizenship. Otherwise, you could have to wait 18 years to be considered an adult." Jay chimed in. "We have already taken care of that." Angel seemed a little irritated by the interruption. "Thank you, counselor," she said, with a passive-aggressive tone. Their conversation continued for about 45 minutes. Tarkara seemed to relish her advice, and before leaving, she promised to correspond with him. When they returned to the hotel, Devora and Tarkara had another chat before bed. "Tarkara, it was a little odd watching someone consume so much booze without getting intoxicated," she said. "According to Penny, I will act drunk if my power cells get too low. I suppose it is a little ironic that drinking alcohol can actually keep me from getting drunk or sober me up if I already am." "Yes, it is. So how do you feel today went?" "Good. Half the day I just sat there, and the rest, I was just asked questions. There was no indication given regarding the results. However, I did find the questions easy to answer, though." "That's got to be good, I suppose. We will know soon enough. And what did you think of Angel?" "She is wonderful. I am so grateful you arranged the meeting, thank you." Chapter 12. Emotional Intelligence Testing. The Emotional Intelligence (EI) test began precisely at 8:30 a.m. Inspector Chico did not administer this test. Instead, an emotionless woman with an angular face entered the room to administer it. She introduced herself as Counselor Carol. She had a more direct and analytical tone, something that Tarkara found odd for a person who was testing emotions. Although formatted like the previous day's interview, Tarkara found the EI testing to be entirely different. The questions related to how he saw himself within his circle, such as whether he could recognize emotional triggers and how he would handle different emotionally charged situations. She required him to answer the questions by choosing options without the opportunity to qualify his selections. He wished one of the questions would be, "How does it make you feel when you are not allowed to explain your answer?" Within an hour, and consistent with her robotic tone, Councillor Carroll told him that she had finished with her examination and that the results would be combined with those from the other testing, and he would be advised of the results and subsequent decision regarding his application the following afternoon. Chapter 13. A Happy Reunion. The wait would have been excruciating to all involved if they had not had an opportunity to conference with Penny and her new baby. "I am so proud of you, Tarkara. Tomorrow you will be fully recognized as a sentient," Penny said excitedly. "Thank you, Penny, but look what you accomplished. A baby, that is amazing." Tarkara genuinely meant what he said to Penny. She had accomplished something that he would never have an opportunity to accomplish. She had procreated. The best he could hope to do would be to build another sentient. He wondered if his goal of becoming an experimental physicist was the best path. Perhaps robotics and cybernetics would be a better career for him to pursue. He brought the subject up with Devora after Penny signed off. "Devora, do you think I would be better served as a roboticist instead of a physicist?" "That is a good question. I thought you had your heart set on the latter." "I did, but seeing Penny bring another life into the world makes you wonder if you could accomplish the cyber equivalent." "Yes, exactly. Only you can make that choice. However, I argue against rash decisions. Tell you what, tomorrow morning we can go to the university and meet with representatives from both departments and then discuss it." "Okay, that would be great. It will also allow us to kill some time before the board releases their decision." Chapter 14. Exploring New Paths. Devora and Tarkara walked the short distance from the testing site and the university. They first met with Dr. Isaac Sung, who just happened to be Penny's thesis advisor. He seemed overjoyed to hear that she had just had a baby. Dark-skinned and thin, Dr. Sung was pleasant and accommodating to all of Tarkara's inquiries. "Such a lovely girl, and Johnny has turned into one hell of a good man. I couldn't be prouder of them." Tarkara enjoyed meeting with Dr. Sung. Although still unsure of which direction to take, he had helped him realize that robotics involved a considerable amount of applied physics. His own CP is an excellent example of this. But that changed when he met Dr. Gregory Reddy. An accomplished experimental physicist, Dr. Reddy had long white hair and an infective smile. He stood quite tall with a rail-thin body. After spending an hour with Tarkara, he told him he would enthusiastically support his application to the university. This excited Tarkara so much that with all the day's events, Devora had concerns that he might have overdone it. Since the board's decision was forthcoming in the next couple of hours, Devora convinced Tarkara to drink some alcohol to charge his power cells. Showing up drunk to his disposition hearing would not serve him well. Chapter 15. Legal Recognition. He had just finished his fourth drink when word reached them that the board had reached a decision. Tarkara took his place behind the lectern, and Jay, Oliva, and Devora sat in the gallery. Tarkara Calvin, you should be aware that every citizen of the FCS, the Venusian Alliance, and Freya City is legally required to meet certain expectations. Both controlling legal authorities follow a policy of hands-off governance. That said, there are certain laws and regulations that everyone must follow. The testing you experienced over the last few days is one example. Other regulations based on the Ethereal Code provide the basis of our civil society. Do you understand this? Yes, sir, said Tarkara. Excellent. On behalf of the powers vested in me by this board, the Free Series Station Confederation, the Venusian Alliance, and Freya City, I recognize your status as a sentient being and adult citizen. Congratulations, Mr. Calvin. Thank you, Your Honor. With our business concluded, I call this meeting adjourned. Tarkara turned to see his beaming entourage. Devora had tears in her eyes, and they all clapped respectfully. Within minutes of the ruling, Devora fully enabled Tarkara's Elnet linker, opening the most extensive, most robust collection of information in human history for his unrestricted perusal. He had a list of items he wanted to research, and now he could start checking things off the list. Chapter 16. Returning to Freya. Freya seemed like an entirely new place when he returned home. He had personally evolved since he left. He was now returning a citizen, a full legal member of society. Mrs. Calvin greeted them when they left the terminal. She gave Tarkara a huge hug and welcomed him home. This made him feel a little awkward because he had never met her, but to her, he was her grandchild. He had expected this. Devora had long discussed it with him. Tarkara rode the Neum home with Mrs. Calvin. Once there, she showed him his room and gave him a house tour. Can we get me some alcohol? It allows me to power up without using my sleeping pod. It is like food to me. Oh, I had not considered that. Go ahead and place an order for anything you want. I have put an allowance in an account for you. You should have plenty of money. If you run short, let me know. She excused herself and went to bed. He had to remind himself that, as an elderly woman, she needed more rest than he did. He only needed to sleep about once a week. He could go longer if he had a good supply of alcohol. However, he did eventually have to sleep to allow his CP to perform self-maintenance. He ordered a supply of high-proof alcohol and had it delivered to their house. Then, he spent the evening checking things off his list of things to research. Chapter 17. Adjusting to Life. A month after his return to Freya, Tarkara had a follow-up appointment with Penny and Devora. The appointment proved a happy reunion. They spent as much time discussing the baby and his life with Mrs. Calvin as they did discussing his emotional and mechanical progress. He promised to come by and visit JJ as soon as possible. At first it was odd living with Mrs. Calvin, but she is so loving and welcoming, I could not help but be happy. She is a little too generous with me, buying me gifts of top-shelf alcohol and designer clothes. Don't get me wrong, I am not complaining. No, I can't imagine you would, Penny laughed. On a professional note, have there been any issues you would like to discuss? Asked Devora. Sometimes she forgets I am not a human. She asked why I stayed up so late, and on several occasions asked if I wanted anything to eat. Sometimes she seems surprised when I ask for vodka, even though she buys it for me all the time. She apparently reminds herself at those moments that I am an android. That is to be expected. Please contact me if it continues, or if anything else starts happening. These checkups continued for 5 more months. During that time, Tarkara visited Penny, Johnny, and JJ at least once a week. He also visited Devora, but she tended to stay in counselor mode, never just conversing with him, so his visits were less frequent. During a visit with Penny's family, a message came for Tarkara. Mrs. Calvin had fallen ill. Johnny stayed with JJ so that Penny could accompany Tarkara. Devora met them at the hospital. She set immediately to the task of calming Tarkara. Why is there no information? When can I see her? Tarkara said, near frantic. Penny stayed close by but quiet, choosing instead to be a comforting presence while Devora stayed engaged with him. A doctor soon came out and asked to speak with him. He told the doctor that Penny and Devora could hear anything he had to say. Mr. Calvin, your grandmother is suffering from cellular degradation. She has been suffering from this for many years, but the ailment has finally caught up with her. I am afraid she will not survive. How long? Asked Penny. A few hours at most. You can speak to her if you like. He led the trio into Mrs. Calvin's room. Penny and Devora hung back near the door so Tarkara could have some privacy. He was likely unaware that he would want privacy. He was less than a year old in actual age. He had also never experienced loss. "Oh, there's my boy," said Mrs. Calvin. He was quiet and deliberate in his body language. "What am I going to do without you, grandmother?" "You will do anything you want. I promise I will never forget you. You gave me life and you have taught me so much. Who will be there with me? I have never been alone." "This is part of life, T. It may be time you went to school on Ceres. You are ready." Tarkara did not respond to her suggestion. Thinking about school or anything else could wait for another day. For the first time, he wished he could be an unthinking dumbbot. He couldn't help but think that all emotions boiled down to pain. Either suffering from it, enjoying the absence of it, or avoiding it. Still, pain was the driving force. Could this be the reason why Penny designed him to feel physical pain? Why else would she have given him the capacity to suffer? He stayed by her bedside until she took her last breath. Penny and Devora stayed with him throughout. Penny hugged him, pulled his head to her shoulder, and caressed him. After a few moments, he pulled back and looked at her. "Penny, you made a big mistake when you designed me." And just what was this terrible mistake? "You didn't give me a way to cry." "Then I will cry for you, Tarkara," she answered, immediately fulfilling the promise. "You listen to me. I will always be there for you. Anytime you need anything, I will be there. You are my son, and I love you. Never doubt that. Not now, not ever." The end. From all of us here at the Elephant Island Chronicles, we hope you have enjoyed this original novella by Marron. Until next time, stay curious.